reading comes from Matthew chapter 2, verses 13 through 23. Now, after they, and the they there is the wise men. So now after they had left, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother by night, and went to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." When Herod saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, he was infuriated. And he sent and killed all the children in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had learned from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled, because they are no more. When Herod died, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who were seeking the child's life are dead." Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was ruling over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And after being warned in a dream, he went away to the district of Galilee. There he made his home in a town called Nazareth, so that what had been spoken through the prophet might be fulfilled. He will be called a Nazarene. Now, if you read in the gospel, it says that when Jesus went into the synagogue, he stood up to read and then sat down to teach. Well, my feet don't like being stood on for long periods of time, so I'm going to sit. Now, I thought about doing my whole sermon in that rhyme, but I thought you might get too interested in the rhyme and miss the message. So let us pray. Lord, touch my tongue, that I may speak your message truly. Open our ears, that we may hear clearly. Open our minds, that we may understand. And open our hearts, that we may accept your guidance. Amen.
Amen.
Now, this is entitled How Herod the Grinch Tried to Steal Christmas. But I've got a subtitle to it too. God has a better plan. See, our liturgy is chronologically out of order, because next year now, January 6th, is Epiphany, when the wise men come. Well, our story takes place after the wise men have come. As a matter of fact, it was their coming that started this whole chain of events. So when the wise men came seeking the king of the Jews, well, they naturally went to the palace of the king. Now, they could tell that the star wasn't overhead the palace, so they knew this wasn't the place, but this was obviously the place to ask for the birth of a king. Now, you know that they're wise men because they did stop to ask. Right? Like all of us wise men. All of y'all wise men. You see, they were confused. I mean, where else would a future king be born but a palace? But as I said, the guiding star that they were following didn't stop at Herod's palace. Well, up until then, nobody was particularly looking for a Messiah. They certainly were seeking him as a child or as a baby. However, the wise men's visit started a whole chain of events. When Herod heard this, he was disturbed. And it says, in all Jerusalem with him. Now, I'm not sure how all Jerusalem heard the story. Maybe the scullery maid heard what was going on and went and told somebody, now, don't tell anybody, but, and of course, in the whole town then. But Herod thought for a moment and said, a future king was born? But that means I have to be dead for someone to become king. So he gathered together the priests and scribes, and he said to them, how come these foreigners know about some threat to my throne, and you haven't mentioned it? I want to know where, and I want to know now. And they said to him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for that was what was written by the prophet. So Herod called the wise men, and being a slick Grinch, told them, oh, sure, we know about this. He's in Bethlehem. And when you found him, come back and tell me so that I can go and adore him. And he thought that was a great Grinchy trick to use the wise men to find the target for him. But of course, the wise men weren't fooled because they were wise men. So when Herod the Grinch thought that there was a chance of a child being born who threatened his throne, and the wise men didn't come back, he started looking also. Now we need a little background about just how paranoid Herod the Grinch was about keeping his throne. At one point, he murdered his wife, whom he claimed to love dearly, because he felt she was plotting against him. 2 sons that he didn't trust, his brother-in-law, who was afraid would seek revenge for his sister's death, his mother-in-law and his wife's grandfather, and at this point, did he really need a reason? Oh yeah, he also murdered his oldest son, whom he feared coveted his throne. So now you get an idea of what kind of man this was. So commanding the murder of all the male children who lived in and around Bethlehem was not something out of character for this Grinch. So after the wise men had moved on, Herod sent his soldiers to Bethlehem with orders to seek out and destroy all boys aged 2 and under. Now, if you remember your Old Testament, where the Pharaoh of Egypt sought to destroy a whole generation of Jews because he feared they were growing too large for them to control. And his method was a form of birth control by having all the male children killed at birth because he saw there was a threat to his rule. Yep, that's the one where the baby Moses was placed in a waterproof basket and set loose in the crocodile-filled Nile in hopes that he would escape the certain murder to come. Yes, his mother had to make a very difficult decision there between certain death and possible death. Talk about a rock and a hard place. But it also kind of points out that powerful and cruel leaders will always fear the innocent. But let's get back to today's story. Joseph had a visitation. As a matter of fact, I was thinking about how many times he was roused from sleep. You remember that he first learned about who Jesus' real father was when he was awakened in his sleep, and then all these times here that he was awakened from sleep. The man probably didn't get a lot of rest for a while. And we had a visitation from the Lord warning him that Herod was seeking to find and kill Jesus, and he was told to take his family and flee to Egypt. Now, it had been a long, long time since the Hebrew people had escaped slavery in Egypt, but they have a long, long memory. As a matter of fact, every year they have a celebration of Passover for the sole purpose of telling each new generation the story of their enslavement, their escape from slavery, and the salvation given to the people by God. So when Joseph was told, flee to Egypt, he must have been thinking, you want me to go where? Hey, I've got a better idea. Mary has a family, Elizabeth and Zacharias, in the hill country of Judea. We could go and stay there.
and Jesus could grow up with his cousin John. That'd work, right? But God said, think about it, Joe. Herod would never think to look in Egypt. And even if he did, he'd never send troops there. He's on good terms with the ruler of Egypt, Cleopatra, who is in turn intimate with Caesar. So Herod would in no way risk jeopardizing his own Roman support by sending troops to Egypt. You see, God always has a better plan. So often I've taken my perfect plan to God and asked him to bless it, and invariably he looked at the goal, past my plan, and says, I can do better than that. How about an amen if God has ever changed your plans like that? Amen. All right. Well, as a matter of fact, I've come to recognize God's answered prayers because they come so unexpectedly in the strangest ways. You know what I mean, right? Well, I'll give you an example from Ella and I's first year of staying full-time in our RV. Here was the question that we were asked repeatedly. Won't you be cold this winter? This is Iowa, after all, and they really know how to have a winter. Snow, freezing rain, more snow, more rain, ice storms, weeks on end when it never gets any warmer than 0 degrees. As a matter of fact, there was one year when a drift come around our trailer and drifted clear to the bottom of the window in the door. Well, that looks high, right? Well, you got to think that the bottom of the door was 3 foot off the ground. So that was a big drift. And for some reason, we couldn't get the door open. That's a fairly typical Iowa winter. Well, that first year, our answer was always, I don't know. Ask us in the spring. Now, I had talked to a lot of people who stayed through the winter in the campground, so I had some ideas on what I needed to do. I needed to completely enclose the area under the trailer with a foam insulation that's got aluminum on each side of it, and add some auxiliary heat underneath the trailer so that our water lines wouldn't freeze. But the number one thing that I knew that I needed was plenty of liquid propane and extra LP tanks. See, we had 2 30-pound tanks that came with the trailer, but I planned to buy 2 more 30-pound tanks so that I could quickly replace them when they ran out. Well, one fall day, I was out strolling around in the campground and a golf cart was coming down the road. Well, I kind of stepped back and waited for them to pass, but they didn't. They stopped and started up a conversation, and in that conversation, it came up that Ella and I were planning to spend the winter there. The man on the cart asked if I had plenty of propane. I said, not yet. He said, would you like a couple of 100-pound tanks? Well, not knowing what he wanted for them, I hesitantly said, well... And he said, you can have both of them for $50. And I've got the hoses and the regulator to hook them up to your system. Sold. Now all I need is a place to store them during the summer because our campground doesn't allow those large tanks to be used during the summer. He said, I'm glad you said that. I've got a small trailer in storage that I use only as a storage shed, and you can have it if you just take over the monthly storage fee. Ooh, done and done. Now that had to be a God thing, because I could never ever have come up with a plan like that. There were too many twists and turns and coincidences. That's in quotation, coincidences, because I don't believe in luck or coincidences. See, I believe that those are words that the devil invented to take the glory away from God. Now, I'm sure most, if not all of you, could tell a similar story of the mysterious and unexpected and outright bizarre ways God has answered prayers in your life, right? Well, Joseph followed God's plan. He went, packed up his wife and baby along with as many of their possessions as they could reasonably carry. Then he began the long journey back to the land that his ancestors had fled from. And they stayed there until Herod the Great was dead. Now, without 24-hour news feed and internet, God had to send an angel to give the Holy Family the good news that they could go back to home. However, even with Herod gone, things weren't all peachy keen back in Israel. On Herod's death, his kingdom was split between his three surviving sons, Philip and Antipas. I think that's thing one and thing two. Anyway, they were sharing the smaller parts of the kingdom, while Archelaus was ruling over Judea and Samaria. Joseph was afraid to go back to Judea because he feared that Archelaus would carry on the same type of Grinchy rule as Herod the Great had. And again, Joseph was warned in a dream, so he took his family to the district of Galilee. Now, Galileans had a reputation of being, well, redneck hillbillies. If Jeff Foxworthy had been alive back then, he might have made jokes that started off with, "You might be a Galilean if you don't need a clean shirt to go to work." Or you might be a Galilean if you get paid at the end of every day. Yes, Jesus' life was totally different from what everyone expected for the Messiah, the forever king. He was born in a stable, went into exile before he could walk, raised in a small rural town, became a carpenter under the training of his earthly father, was the servant to all, allowed himself to be beaten, humiliated, and crucified. And he started a spiritual revolution that continues even to this day. Now, there's an old Yiddish proverb, and since I'm not an old Yid, an old Jew, I can't actually read it, but it's translated as, "The man plans and God laughs." And it certainly rings true to Proverbs 19:21. It says, "There are many intentions in the heart of man, but the will of the Lord stands firm." See, God repeatedly is doing the unexpected. He made a promise to Abraham that his descendants would own all the land that he walked over, and that one of them would be a blessing to all the world. Sounds good, right? The problem was that he and his wife were old, like really old. So he had no sons. So Sarah and her handmaiden and him decided to give God a helping hand, and Abraham had a son by the handmaiden. But God had a better plan. Sarah would have her own son to inherit the promise. God used Gideon. Now, I gotta say, the story of Gideon is one of my very favorite stories in the whole Bible. Because he was, the whole Middle East actually was being overrun by the Midians. And he was kind of hiding down in a wine press to kind of separate the wheat from chaff down there, which is hard to do because normally that's done up on a big flat area so that the wind can blow the chaff away. He was down in a hole. And when the angel came to him, Gideon described himself as the least important person in the whole nation. But God gave him an army. But then God had a better plan, and he whittled that army down to only 300 untrained soldiers with only torches and bugles to defeat the Midianites, the scourge of the Middle East. God used Jonah, the worst prophet in the world, to deliver a message of warning to his enemies in Nineveh. Now, Jonah hoped to witness their destruction, but God had a better plan. The Ninevites repented and were saved. King Saul brought out an army to defeat the Philistines, but God had a better plan. He used a teenager named David to defeat the giant Goliath and deliver the Philistines into the hands of the Israelites. Saul of Tarsus was hunting down the early Christians to destroy them, but God had a better plan. He used him to spread the gospel to the non-Jewish nations and peoples. God's chosen people hoped for a mighty king born in a palace, but God had a better plan. He used a virgin to birth him in a stable. The Israelites assumed that the Messiah would be trained in all the arts of war, but God had a better plan. He entrusted the Messiah's earthly training to a blue-collar worker named Joseph. So remember, though this world is filled with Grinches that try to mislead us, tear us down, and yes, kill our souls, trust that God has a better plan. You can put your faith in God to direct your steps. You might never be visited by a messenger of God saying, "Get up." But then again, you might. You might be visited by angels that you don't even recognize. God will guide the feet of the righteous. So do all that you can to live a life of righteousness in tune with the will of God. He has sent his Spirit to dwell in his children who are called by his name. Though the Grinch had a plan, God has a better plan for your life. Amen. Now, we do a prayers for the people here. Now, we used to do joys and concerns. Lately, we've only been doing concerns.